Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our basement Bible study. Tonight we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 16 through 22. As we move into this section of the book, we'll begin to see Koheleth examining the idea of injustice and iniquity in his society. Like most people today, Koheleth is lamenting and even despondent over the amount of injustice that he sees. He sees good people suffering and wicked people getting away with their misdeeds. Now, I think as human beings, we have an inherent revulsion for the idea of injustice. And we may not always agree on what defines that term, but when we do sense injustice in our hearts, we're not happy about it. So as we explore this section, I want to divide it into 4 subsections, if you will. In this first section, with 4 subsections to it, as I'll explain, Koheleth is going to examine injustice as he sees it in the court and justice system and the corruption that he sees there. So the first subsection, we're going to divide it up here by verses. In verse 16, he'll make his initial observation. Then in verse 17, he'll make his own declarative statement of the injustice he sees. And we'll briefly examine each of those. Then we're going to move into verses 18 through 21, which are kind of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of this section. And here he's going to reflect on what judgment looks like to him and how many seem to escape judgment. And how that final judgment, which is death, really comes to all of us regardless of our deeds. Finally, verse 22 is going to bring it all sort of to a resolution. He decides how he's going to live with it and trust in God to make it all right in the end. So without further ado, let's begin. Here's verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. Now, most of that's pretty self-explanatory. I just want to clarify that when he says in the place of righteousness, he means the court system of the day. That is the place where they would have gone to find righteousness. But as he observes, they're finding wickedness instead. Moving into verse 17, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. So Koheleth is acknowledging that at a sort of gut level in his heart, he knows that what he sees is wrong, but he also knows that in the end, God will make it right. He knows that God's judgment will take place in God's time. I think here it's important to understand that Koheleth and his society would not have had as well-developed an understanding of the afterlife at this point. Certainly not the same understanding that we have of it as Christians. So much of his yearning for justice is going to be with the idea that it must take place in the earthly life. And that's important to understand as we move into the next verses. We're going to discuss that at a little more length. Verses 18 through 21. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So here Koheleth is making a stark distinction between man and God. In fact, he's saying we are far more like the beasts of the earth than we are God. And he's right. Let's be honest, we are more like animals. We require sustenance, we require healing, we require rest. We were created by God, whereas God is uncreated. He is everlasting. While we rely on God to exist, as do the animals, God exists relying on nothing. Now the use of breath here, let me find it. Actually, he doesn't say breath. He says, the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth. Oh, here it is. Here's where he says breath. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. The use of breath to describe something in common with animals is really important. In his day, Koheleth would have understood this breath as an important thing given both to the animals by God and to man. Remember, in Genesis, we see God breathe life into man. So in many ways, man is just like the animals and ultimately suffers the same fate on earth, that is to die, and have their bones decay back into dust. But Koheleth would have had a slightly different understanding of what happened to the breath that was in man. Whereas the breath of the animals, once they're dead, it goes down into the earth with their bodies. But in that day, people would have believed that the breath that had originally been breathed into them by God would actually return to the source of that breath. But not a lot is discussed further as to what that existence after death would look like. We have some references through Job, and in, I believe it's 2 Samuel, David refers to being with his recently deceased baby in another life. So there certainly was an understanding of an afterlife. But again, as I said earlier, it's not quite as developed as we would know it in the Christian sense today. So as I said, not a lot is discussed further as to what that existence after death would look like. This is part of why justice in this life was so high on Koheleth's list. And it also appears that at best, Koheleth may actually be a little bit agnostic on the subject of life after death. Verse 21 leads us to believe that. He says, "Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth?" So I would say he's at least undecided. So why is this a problem from the perspective of justice? Why is Koheleth upset? Well, simply put, dying was often seen as the most stark form of God's justice. The wicked were to die. We see that all over Levitical law. But if all men die, then we all share the same fate. The wicked are no worse off than the righteous in the end. In this case, it's less about justice than it is about timing. Of course, as Christians, we know this to be not true, but we'll get back to that in just a minute. Finally, verse 22. "So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him?" So finally, Koheleth arrives at a sort of "you only live once" conclusion. As we saw at the end of chapter 2, Koheleth acknowledges that joy comes from God, and so we might as well enjoy that joy where we can. Of course, we must do so with faith in God and in ways that honor God as a wise man, not as a fool. In the last sentence, Koheleth asks, who can bring him to see what will be after him? Wow, what a great segue into the conclusion for this week. Remember, I've suggested the Old Testament should be read as a foreshadowing of Christ, and that's not my idea. Some really smart people came up with it. I'm just copying it. Today, we have the ability to look back and think, yeah, Koheleth is sad about what he sees, but we have the rest of the story. We know that if we trust in God, have faith in the redeeming sacrifice of Christ and his triumph over death, then we will enjoy a fate so much greater than death. Even though our individual actions may not warrant it, we are made righteous by our faith in Christ. He has paid the ransom for our lives, and all he asks is that we follow him. This is the wisdom that Koheleth is seeking, and I find this book inspiring because his own laments and even doubts probably reflect what many of us have gone through on our own Christian journey. I know I have, and probably will continue to. Looking through the lens of finite time, it's pretty easy to get upset by the injustice we see in the world. It can be heartbreaking, especially at times like this when the world seems especially grim. But our faith in God tells us that however things work out on this side of life, we have hope of something so much better on the other side. Through Christ, we can look forward to a time where injustice is put right, where illness and injury are healed, and where death has no power. And that is the good news of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me this week. We will start on to chapter 4 next week. I look forward to seeing you all soon.